Before we begin, I need you to forget everything you learned in Western history class about the ancient world. Because right now, historians estimate that the Great Wall of China, the one every textbook called the greatest construction in human history, stretches roughly 13,000 miles. The Great Walls of Benin, in what is today southern Nigeria, stretch over 16,000 kilometers. That is 4 times the length of the Great Wall of China, and they were built with no slave labor, no iron tools, and no written blueprints. The New Scientist, the world's leading general science journal, called the Benin Walls, and I quote, the largest earthworks in the world carried out prior to the mechanical age. So why have you never heard of them? At its height around the 13th through 16th centuries, Benin City was not a collection of huts. It was a meticulously engineered metropolis. Its avenues were wide enough for 15 men to ride abreast on horseback. Dutch trader Alfred Dapper, visiting in the 1600s, wrote that the city's main street was broader than Amsterdam's finest boulevard and stretched as far as the eye could see. The streets were paved, packed earth sealed against the rains, and they were lit. Oil lamps mounted on wooden stakes ran the length of every major avenue. Benin City had street lighting centuries before London. The layout was fractal, a pattern that repeats at every scale. Scholars of urban planning who studied aerial surveys of the ruins found the same mathematical geometry governing the palace grounds, the guild districts, and the outermost defense walls. At the center of this living geometry stood the palace of the Oba, the divine king. Its walls were covered in hand-cast brass plaques. Its towers were topped with enormous cast bronze serpents, their scales glinting in the equatorial sun. This was not a kingdom on the margins of civilization. This was civilization, running parallel to every empire in Europe, with its own mathematics, its own governance, its own art. This wasn't a kingdom on the margins of civilization. This was civilization, running parallel to every empire in Europe, with its own mathematics, its own governance, its own art form that the Western world would not be able to replicate for another 2 centuries. Between the 13th and the 17th centuries, Benin's artisans produced what are now called the Benin bronzes, over 3,000 cast metal sculptures, plaques, and commemorative heads. When the British Army first saw them in 1897, they were so technically perfect they initially refused to believe Africans had made them. One officer wrote, "This must be ancient Greek." But they were not ancient Greek. They were Benin, and they were made in a tradition stretching back 400 years. Benin was not isolated. It traded in pepper, ivory, cloth, and bronze with Portuguese merchants as early as 1485. The Yoruba maintained a diplomatic correspondence with the King of Portugal, 2 separate worlds, and they treated each other as equals. If you believe history needs to be redrawn, that whole civilizations have been erased from the story we were given, hit the subscribe button. Every Saturday, we restore one lost empire, one truth at a time. February 1897, the British Empire dispatched what they called a punitive expedition to Benin City. The stated cause? The killing of a British trade delegation. But the real calculation, access to trade routes, rubber, and palm oil. 1,000 British troops armed with Maxim machine guns, a weapon Benin warriors had never seen, marched on a city whose walls had stood for 5 centuries. The city burned for 3 days. The palace was looted. The bronzes, over 3,000 of them, were loaded onto British ships. They were sold to European museums to offset the cost of the expedition that destroyed the civilization that made them. Today, the Benin bronzes sit in the British Museum in London, the Metropolitan in New York, the Ethnologisches Museum in Berlin, the Benin Royal Museum, built to house them, sits largely empty. And the walls, those 16,000 kilometers of earthworks, were dismantled by colonial administrators who needed the clay for roads. The greatest earthworks in pre-industrial human history used as gravels. Benin was not defeated, it survived. The Kingdom of Benin exists today. The royal court of the Oba remains active. The tradition of bronze casting was never fully broken, and the new generation of scholars, archaeologists, and Nigerians are rebuilding what was deliberately forgotten. The walls can be measured, the bronzes can be counted, the history can be restored. The question is whether the institutions that hold these objects and the histories that erase these stories are willing to let that happen. The 3,000 Benin bronzes were taken in 1897 to pay for the destruction of the civilization that created them. Some have been returned, most have not. Here is the question I want you to sit with and answer in the comments below. If a museum built its entire collection on objects taken by force, and those objects are the only surviving record of a destroyed civilization, does returning them correct history, or does it erase the only record the Western world preserve? There is no easy answer. That is the point. See you next Saturday.